Welcome, DEENA METZGER.
So I want to start with a poem that I think many of you know that I wrote many, many years ago. But the times that we're in, these critical times that we can characterize by fire and flood, but are really storms in our psyches and in our political systems, in our communities, as much as they are storms in the outside world, that these times that call us to critical activity and understanding, because of these times I had to change a word in this poem, and the change is from slowly to, as you will hear. There are those that want to set fire to the world. We are in danger. There is time only to work wisely. There is no time not to love. I did not know when I wrote A Rain of Nightbirds, or when it was given to me, how appropriate, how terribly appropriate it would be for these times. So I want to begin also with the words that I wrote to those who endorsed this book. The world is moving into a shadow of great darkness. Despite these tragic circumstances, there is the light of the undeniable presence of the elementals, the spirits, and the hearts of all those committed to this planet. We are called to so much more than protest. We are called to fundamentally change our thinking, systems, and lives, to divest from all forms and activities that lead to genocide and the ravages of pollution and climate change for humans and non-humans alike. The devastation we call climate change and the barbaric ruins of the Anthropocene began in North America in 1492 with the brutal conquest and colonization. Paradoxically, the Lakota prayer, METZGER, provides us all with the essential guidance needed to transform and sustain life. Please enter the conversation. It was February 2011 when I just published another novel and was hoping to be inspired to write the next. Walking in Joshua Tree National Park, I found myself preoccupied by picking up garbage until my pockets and hands were full, and yet there was no end to it. I'm sorry. The words surprised me. I had said them aloud. I'm sorry, I repeated. That's when I heard the voice. You know, the voice said. Her name is Sandra Birdswell, and she is a meteorologist. The voice spoke with authority. I couldn't dismiss it. Authority and insistence. I had been longing for a novel, and now it was being given to me, so I could not refuse, even though I knew nothing about the character. I had no choice but to accept the challenge that would take me far beyond myself. I did not understand where I was being led, but I had to commit myself and write what was called for. At the moment of this book's inception in Joshua Tree, Terence Green didn't exist. Then a year later, he came to be. To me, as the writer, Terence Green is a greater mystery than Sandra Birdswell, who introduced him. Once manifest, Sandra determined the story that's being told, and Terence, she revealed, was at the core. At that first moment in Joshua Tree, I didn't know anything about Sandra Birdswell, except her name, her profession, but not what followed from that, a vast terrain both entirely unknown and completely mystifying. I knew less about Terence Green. The process of writing seems simple, but it isn't. Write a character into a story, press save. He or she exists. Highlight his or her name and the surrounding paragraphs, press the scissor icon on the toolbar, one or the other or both die. Then press save to ensure the demise. Theoretically, Terence Green can be entirely disappeared from the text. I could paste the words that describe him into a file labeled outtakes, and he would only exist in limbo, waiting to know if he will ever have a real life. That possibility is only theoretical. Sandra appeared, and then Terence appeared. I had great trepidation about writing about him. I didn't know if I have the right to write about a native man, inasmuch as cultural appropriation is an ongoing violation. But I didn't have the right to refuse him either. Finally, I had to accept what negative consequences might come to me from my limitations, and hope to have the skill to record his true self, to honor and respect him as is his due. I had to yield to him. He wanted to live. Sandra insisted, and then he insisted. He asserted that the text cannot exist without him. He carries wisdom. When Terence came forth, Hostin Seda began to speak more forthrightly. He is an elder, and certainly a wisdom keeper. The time for this wisdom has come. They will not be erased. It was early, long before dawn, when light awakened Sandra Birdswell. The broken cloud cover was shimmering with a red glow. It reminded her of the full moon turning red a year and a half before, on August 12, 23, when proximate to Mars at its perigee to Earth. The radiance was unnerving, as the moon had been then, a blood tide. She propped herself up on pillows and stared out the window, almost eye to eye with the clouds themselves. She waited, listened. Could this shimmer be caused by red waves similar to those she had seen several times in her life, as they rose from the imminently vibrating earth before extended earthquakes? But no. Everything on the land seemed unmoving. The red persisted. She sensed that deep in space, a flare from the body of the sun was rising up, perhaps already streaming out through the sun's surface towards Earth, across the 93 million miles. That is the exact distance that makes life possible. She was sure she wasn't seeing an aurora borealis. Glimmering clouds, perhaps the entire night sky, luminous waves of color, sensation and light had awakened her, were coming in as if beneath the radar. The physical effect of the flare had evoked an analogous attunement to global events that concerned her, a visceral experience of the twist of tornadoes, thunderstorms, cyclones, hurricanes spinning across land and oceans. Familiar vertigo seized her not from the motion, but from the alteration of beauty and distress, her gut knowing. She had sensed this since childhood, but lately the sensations were accompanied with grim understanding. These were no mere natural events. The Anthropocene, she thought. We are responsible. Sandra's father was a physician, a good country doc, the kind that we don't have anymore, but that we remember once existed in this country. And Sandra's mother dies in childbirth, and John Birdswell is there, and as he watches his wife die, he lifts the baby out of her and puts Sandra on his chest. And he's a really remarkable father. And so Sandra learns how to care for, really how to be a human being from being raised by this father. And whenever she possibly can, she goes to work with him. He carries her. She's at the office, she's at the hospital. It's really an extraordinary relationship. And people are always saying to her, are you going to be a doctor like your father? And she says, I want to doctor the earth. Visiting Hosteen over the years, Sandra had been able to observe him and his friends engage doctoring, an entirely different approach to health and healing than the medical ways. Her father's office and the Hogan were her places of learning. She didn't have to choose one over another. Both extended mystery and wonder. But the first time she saw a medicine man extend his hand to scan a patient's body, she felt a shiver of recognition. She wanted to meet the earth the way he approached the man or woman lying on carefully folded blankets on the ground. He moved with quiet attention, deftly tracing every energetic current and flow in the field, both discerning and easing in one gesture with his sure understanding, after years of apprenticeship, training, and prayer, that the restoration of the patient's body and the soul of the patient could occur just so. His hand moved like weather does, in waves and eddies, restoring the patterns. Sometimes a hand, sometimes a feather. Common sights took on new meanings. Sometimes she saw that the bird passing overhead, its wings stirring the air, was bringing relief to the earth beneath as she cooled for an instant from the inflammation, the fevers, a world on fire. Sandra paid attention. Hosteen's example taught her to be aware of assumptions or judgments. Not knowing what something meant, not interpreting, became a habit. If her mind was still, it seemed the non-humans could be heard. As with her father, it was easier to respond this way in Hosteen's presence. Not easy at home, increasingly more difficult the older she became, the more intense and focused her studies. But during the crucial years before university, it became second nature to live the analogy between healing the mammalian bodies, humans and non-humans, and healing the earth, that body. A murmuration of starlings, the soughing of crow's wings, might bring relief. Why not? She did not know about shape-shifting, but longed to become one of those birds. When Sandra goes to graduate school, no longer studying meteorology because the times have changed so drastically. She now is studying climatology. She needs to have a sense of what is happening on the entire globe and what those larger patterns are. The chair of her department is Terence Green, and he is a mixed blood man. The Holy Wind. With these words, Dr. Terence Green, chair of the Department of Climatology, opened his introductory lecture. We have come here to study wind. Remember, however, that wind is always invisible and ungraspable. Holy wind, say the original people of this land, in your way you will forget this again and again. Wind is ungraspable in all meanings of the word. You will think you see it, think you have it pinned, but you won't. Different people refer to wind as spirit and breath. Nish'i, the holy wind, the DEENA say. In Hebrew, wind, breath, ruach, spirit, similar. As atmospheric scientists, as climatologists, you will have to study and understand wind and apply your knowledge and observations to follow its different, most common, and most erratic courses. However, whatever you learn, do not forget the holy wind is always beyond you. You may see its imprint, you may see evidence of its landing, you may fly into it as a hurricane hunter, spy on it as a tornado chaser, you may think you can measure and predict it, and to accomplish this will be your work, but it will always be beyond you. Buddhists say, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Phony scientists would know that numbers are not the thing in itself. To understand that you will never see and never understand wind is the first step to knowledge. Dr. Terence Green turned on a fan and said, because you can make the wind blow, don't think you can control the forces of nature. Know that trying to control them can do life great injury. You may be able to turn the fan on and off, but you aren't able to turn wind on or off. You know how things are. One goes to university. There's the chair of the department. You don't really pay a lot of attention to him. You're sort of annoyed that he doesn't think more of you than you think he should. He doesn't want to support your dissertation, even though he's a native man and you're writing about traditional ecological knowledge. But you write the dissertation, and it does get approved, and you do get the doctorate, even though he hasn't been ostensibly supporting you fully. And then enough time passes, as it does with a therapist or a psychologist or psychiatrist, and now you're permitted to meet and have a conversation. And so one day, Terence Green calls Sandra and invites her, go out to the desert and look at the clouds. Well, didn't take very long. I think 24, maybe 36 hours. And they are committed, somehow married in their souls. So both of them had houses which they really loved. She had bought a beautiful house which was round with a platform on the roof so she could go up and watch the weather, the clouds coming in, etc. He had built a long house also in the woods, in the hills, not in the same area as she. So he brings her to his house where they live in a tent. Terence showed her how to build a fire on a sprinkling of tobacco from the materials on the ground. He taught her the fire song. When the fire was hard to start, she sang it, and sometimes it helped. When he sang, the fire started. It wasn't technology, but the singing that made the difference. She had acquired the song, but it wasn't in her yet. Sandra asked Terence, is it good to be naked or clothed before the fire? He said, it doesn't matter. Fire sees right through you when it burns away all your impediments. To fire, you are a breath that will bring it to light. They were in the tent, as in a den, not hibernating, but secluded. It was so quiet, she began to feel the global tremors. More and more she felt tides and the sun's energy. Sometimes she thought she felt the stretch of the moonrise, its drift across the night sky, and the yoga of setting. The new moon was a ping, like an egg leaving her ovary. She was a stringed instrument the wind played, the earth vibrated in her. What had been intermittent became frequent. She had never had words for these sensations. She had not understood their meaning. If the earth is alive, she began tentatively. Hosteen spoke of the earth in this way. Terence put his hand on the small of her back, gentle, holding her up, listening. Terence added slightly, almost indiscernible pressure on her back, meeting her exactly, responding to the increase in equally indiscernible tremors, so that his touch continued to be consoling, if imperceptible. Earth's pulse, or the earth's swirl on its axis, or the suction and slide of the magnetic pole shifting, a windstorm, a tornado, a series of multiple sensations, as if she were in weather itself. All of it. He held her, so she let herself sink into the center of it. She was the axis and everything turning around her. But then she was taken by a stab of nausea, followed by dizziness and the fear that the earth was buckling under her, earthquake, landslide, or tsunami somewhere. These were common enough. Any might be occurring, and so she was perceiving them within her. Or an aerial bombardment, a pipeline exploding, a nuclear plant leaking, drilling, taking out the lifeblood, mining, causing huge abscesses, iridescent pains, knives jabbing in sequence, or the sensation of thorns growing into her flesh. And then fevers taking her, her skin blackening under her soft shirt until she shook with sudden cold. In contact with her, he felt it all as well, his hand burning, then turning to ice. He could not flinch or withdraw. Dread. Then woe. Still, as she was willing to experience it all on behalf of the mother, so was he. Alongside the pain, the wonder of that continuity. If the earth is alive, she was going to dare to go further. If earth is alive, if earth is our mother. Sandra's thoughts, jagged and breathless as they were, continued. Sandra was in the space between breaths, where everything is and nothing moves. Or suddenly, despite or through the pain, it was clear Earth was alive, and Earth was the mother. Sandra had a mother. She stood up. She stood up straight to contain the quivering that was overtaking her. She had a mother. The mother was alive. Then came the avalanche of bereavement, devastation. She moaned. Her eyes rolled back into her head as she shook and wailed, tearing, stabbing, explosive, burning pain, as all the ways the earth was being violated were enacted inside her. the great weight of knowing without being able to mitigate, to save, to change, overwhelmed her. Almost greater than the agony of knowing, of seeing clearly, was the anguish of being helpless. The book is set in 2007. It was a very important year for those of us who really care about the Earth. It was the year of the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change. This international assessment of the reality of climate change is the most important official document of this time, Terence thought. Conservative and compromised as it was, it had been written by contributors from across the globe. It declared climate change is real. The Anthropocene, real. He knew what a courageous step it had been to confirm that the use of fossil fuels is responsible for the dangerous rise of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So Terence is, he's undone, actually, by reading it. And it's hundreds or thousands of pages. And in that document, there are about 4 sentences that speak about traditional ecological knowledge. 2 tiny paragraphs that refer to some people in Africa who the scientists found knew something about the climate and how it was changing and how to meet it. And for him to find that after having been a climatologist in a Western university, and to realize that he had inadvertently, without realizing it, stepped away from that deep knowledge of his people, undid him. And so he actually ran out of the office. He took the report, he ran out of the office, and he goes to the mountain. He goes to Mount Hood, which is the mountain where, when he was very young, his grandfather and his uncle had taken him. And he goes there to do ceremony. And he stands there and he prays. He prays through the night. And then he starts walking down the mountain. And as he walks down, he collapses. The IPCC report, not what was in it. He had known it all. So had Sandra. But those 2 small references to indigenous wisdom, brave references, he acknowledged bitterly. He didn't know how the authors had gotten them through the long process of submission and scrutiny, leading to a final accord of all persons and institutions concerned. Climate change? Yes. Grave? Yes. Human causation? Yes. Why not consult with the people who had lived there, who had always lived there, the people of the land? Terence had his own answers. A clan brother, a medicine man, had bemoaned his difficulty in healing the Wasichu, white people's illnesses. In order to heal, he had to go deep into the mind of the affliction. He could bring healing to those diseases that were endemic to the land and to the people, but the alien disturbances, the mind of the Wasichu was so convoluted he couldn't find its logic. And when the alien illnesses affected his people, he couldn't bring himself to accept the standard medical treatments that were designed in a laboratory where a stranger who would never meet his patient and would likely never encounter the illness in the flesh still created an exact potion designed to cure. Why assume the stranger in a laboratory would know more than someone who had been born on the land, exposed to the elements, who was fluent in the language of the other creatures? Did a stranger really know more about the atmosphere from his instruments and research than his grandfather had known about winds? Standing at the foot of the mountain, the sun setting and turning the snow red, Terence was no longer on a mountain, but at a riverbank in Falling Timbers, Ohio, on August 20th, 1794, with the story his grandfather had told him. They had told him the story so he would know how important it was to remember, even though he would forget. The moccasins trickled blood in the sand, and the water was red in the river. History had been passing through him like a jet stream, and he traveled on its back to the armies that George Washington had sent to fight Blue Jacket, the Shawnee chief, leading the Northwest Confederacy. Blue Jacket, the war chief, was trying to protect the lands east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes, which the British had ceded to the U.S. as if they owned them by right of war 213 years earlier. And concurrently present, he was seeing the armies to the present day. The past enfolded itself into the future that cocooned it. The beginning of this nation state and the end link through the simultaneity of time and blood. On the other side of the mountain, Hanford Nuclear Reservation, was the dark longing, quote, looking for a stone, as Sweet Medicine, one of the chiefs of the Cheyenne, had put it, that would take the white men across the continent in every direction, including here where Terence was standing now. They will tear up the earth, and at last you will do it with them. When you do, you will become crazy and will forget all that I am teaching you. The white people will be all over the land, and at last you will disappear. You will do it with them. And when you do, you will become crazy. Yes, he had become crazy. He had known this for a long time. Sandra and he joked that everyone living now was mad. The internal structure that sustained all life was collapsing. The 500-year war against his people and similar wars against the people of the earth all across the earth were culminating in extinction. The moment he fell, Terence accepted the blow. He bowed down to receive it. He called it in. He was speaking aloud, though he didn't know to whom he was speaking or whether he was speaking, or in a dream of speaking, or in a spirit realm to which he had been transported by what appeared to be injury but was something else. He was no longer in time or place. There were 1,000 different ways he had accepted that spirits are real, although Western mind was a miasma of denial that entered through the cracks and fissures of his being, like water seeping through rock, undermining the original structure of all things. "My mother," he said, as if emerging from a war. He was going back through the white mother line to the origin of the bloodletting that had become an incessant flood. He sought the origin of the hemorrhage of this time. He wanted to bleed his mother out of him. He had stood at the snow line that was turning red. He had to do a scan. He had to know before the bleeding stopped. It wasn't injury, it was knowledge. The bleed was memory. He had to taste it in this form. The bleed from his brain that contained his experiences and his ancestors and their experiences, encoded outside of language, but translating now into thought, which was the way he knew things. In sharp contrast, the doctors would inevitably make understanding out of alien figures, chemistries, test results, computations that for them, somewhat, but no longer for him, translated into information. Information is not wisdom. What could blood tell him? And what did blood want him to know? He had to know if he was a hybrid or a battlefield. From the point he had reached on Mount Hood, he couldn't see the Hanford nuclear reservation that had taken his sacred Rattlesnake Mountain, Lalique, into its maw. Though it was about 150 miles as the crow flies, he could smell Hanford, the way his people had been trained to smell the death force as it came west over the mountains from across the eastern sea. Not that awareness had enabled them to successfully resist, overcome, or escape. It had turned the entire continent into a marsh. It smelled of sorrow. Broken sorrow, salt sorrow, poison sorrow, radiant sorrow. The way that rivers and oceans smell when all the fish die in them at once. Here he was, Terence Green. If he began to think in English, he would be gone. His injuries would deepen. In the English language, he was mortally wounded and had to get to a hospital quickly. Only Western medicine could save him. But if he forbid himself English, its fears and alarms, and entered an indigenous language, even if he had only shards of it or a child's vocabulary, he would gain another understanding. Here he was in the dynamic interchange, in the unceasing whirl, the ever-present stillness which was encompassed in the 10,000 years of his almost, but only almost, extinct language. Here he was in his language, the deeper knowing. Enabled by his language, a greater agony was coursing through him, melting him into the hidden fire at the molten core of the mountain and into the air around him, Hanford Nuclear Reservation. That abomination, violating the rivers, the poisoned Columbia River, her veins and arteries pumping plutonium, strontium-90, phosphorus 32, zinc 65, arsenic 76, neptunium 239, sodium 24, radionuclides, radiation into the aquifer, the torque of mutation, blood clotting, the stream seeping into the terrain, his body, the earth, the winds, the fire, and the water, a dynamic yet unmoving exchange, interpenetration. The blood, then, that he tasted was not a tear, but a dissolve. Mind succumbed to heart. Before he spun into unconsciousness, he managed to scrape some earth into his mouth. To stanch the bleeding, he explained to himself, it was dank, sweet, and cold. A poultice that eased his grief. He gave his body up to the dark vultures and carrion eaters who would gather should he die in that spot. He heard the unlikely sound of an owl in daylight, and he blessed whatever his future might be. He blessed Sandra and the mountain. I'm sorry, were his last words before the dark entered like a landslide of ice and snow. I'd like to end with a poem. A greater silence. Soon there will be a greater silence than there is now. I do not want to be here alone. When the last tree falls, may I be under it. May the last tree take me down.